Sounding Crisis, the research project on climate change and sound.
So hi everyone. Welcome to the second session of the Energy Consciousness Lectures. My name is Anja and this is Jenny, my colleague.
Hello.
And we are the organizers of the lecture series and reading group on Energy Humanities. You can check out our blog post on the soundingcrisis.eu/blog for more on its background. And now I'll also just post the link in the chat, or you'll find it underneath the YouTube recording. But it's our great pleasure to welcome today Dominic Boyer as our guest speaker, who has tuned in from Los Angeles. Dominic, welcome to the second Energy Consciousness Lecture.
Thank you so much.
It's wonderful having you. And before I'll hand it over to you, let me quickly introduce Dominic. Dominic is a professor for anthropology at Rice University in Houston, Texas, USA, and Berggruen Fellow for 2021-22. Together with his partner, Cymene Howe, he is also a filmmaker and a podcaster, two aspects of the work we also want to talk about in the next roundabout 75 minutes. But first and foremost, Dominic is one of the founding figures of Energy Humanities and therefore the perfect match for an introduction to this relatively new field of research. From 2013 to 2019, he served as founding director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Research in the Human Sciences at Rice University. Together with Imre Seeman, literary scholar and professor at the University of Waterloo in Canada, Dominic published in March 2014 a little manifesto called The Rise of Energy Humanities. 2017, they edited together at Johns Hopkins University Press, Energy Humanities and Anthropology. And as a preparation for this session, we read his excellent essay, Energopower, an introduction, in our reading group. And this he further developed into his book, Energopolitics, Wind and Power in the Anthropocene, which was published 2019 at Duke University Press. All this shows perfectly, without any doubt, what a great honor and pleasure it is to have Dominic with us today. We are very much looking forward to your introduction and afterward discussing the idea and need of energy humanities with you. So, Dominic, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Anja, and thank you, Anja and Jenny, both for organizing this series. It's great that we're kind of a more intimate group because I think we can probably do away with some of the more formal aspects of the lecture. I'm going to give a little presentation that's going to touch on some aspects of my work that are probably familiar to you, having read Energopower, and others that may be less familiar, especially some of the more creative projects I've been engaged in. So I'm going to throw a lot of things out kind of quickly, and then we'll just pick up whichever threads you find intriguing to talk about. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation. But for the moment, I will go ahead and share my screen. So you can see that, I hope. And let me just go ahead and, okay. All right, so can everyone see and hear? All right, perfect. So this is, the image here is culled from today's news. About a year, maybe it was 2 years ago, I decided that every time I give a public talk, I would try to see if there was a climate-related disaster happening somewhere in the world that same day within the previous 24-hour news cycle. And I haven't been disappointed yet. The world seems to deliver climate disasters with unceasing frequency. And this one is particularly poignant for me for reasons that will become evident when we get to the last slide of the presentation today. This is about some tragic mudslides that are happening in Brazil right now, whereas in so many parts of the world, new intensities and frequencies of rainfall are destabilizing communities. And just this summer, Cymene and I were in Iceland doing research, and we went to a small town in the eastern part of Iceland that had seen the worst mudslides in its history too. And it's difficult to appreciate if you haven't been around a mudslide just how devastating they are. They don't sound that significant, but it's sort of like imagining some kind of a tractor trailer like powering through your house and burying everything you own in 3 meters of mud. It's an incredible thing to experience. So this is happening in Brazil right now, a sort of a gateway to the, if you will, what keeps me going in this area of research is the constancy of the climate emergency. But I didn't start there. I started working on media and knowledge, and in fact, Anya and I were chatting a little bit about journalism, corresponding a bit. This is where I started. I started doing work on journalists as an anthropologist of professions and experts and cultures of expertise. My first book project focused on what happened to East German journalists after German reunification and was a study of the integration, or perhaps better put, colonization of the East German media sphere by the West German state and civil society. And that was followed then by a study about a little over 10 years later that focused on news journalists, mostly in Germany, but also to some extent in the United States, and their adaptation to digital information technology, the ways that the new speeds and scales and intensities of information flows are challenging journalists' sense of their own expertise, but also in strange ways strengthening them and making them feel as though they still have a special professional capacity to manage and curate information flows. And sandwiched in between is just a small book about how we think and talk about media that is just more of a kind of a popular oriented project. But you probably, for this conversation, I'm imagining, are more familiar with the later work, the work I've done since 2008, 2009, focused on energy and environment issues. And as Anya Kadli said, I mean, part of this has been about helping to articulate the need for more conversations concerning energy within environmental humanities, broadly put. And this is, in Europe, in German terms, which I'm, sort of always thinking a little bit as an anthropologist of Germany in terms of the way Germans think about it. It's the Geisteswissenschaften. It's, there's not a good translation for that in English. I sometimes say human sciences, but it's, we would say more, sort of more commonly humanities. And I think I'm happy to talk more about energy humanities and what it is, what it's aspired to be. But I think above all, you'd have to say it's a collective project, and it's a project with many roots and tendrils. And it, as Donna Haraway might put it, it's got a symbiotic tangling that involves peoples across the world. But interestingly, I think that the two of the places in North America where it first gained sort of institutional traction and visibility were at the University of Alberta, where Imre, together with many of his colleagues, it was quite a large group, formed the Petrocultures Research Network. At the same time that in Houston, we were forming our center, SENS, that was focusing on precisely sort of the place of energy within today's environmental and social challenges. And, if you know anything about Alberta and Houston, you know that these are the oil centers, they're the petrocultural hubs of their respective nation states. And so, I think there's something to be said about being so close to the belly of the beast, as we say, of feeling like petroculture is not just something that one experiences as a consumer, but one can see the infrastructures of production, one can see its direct influence upon political power in all sorts of very obvious and also perhaps more subtle ways, that has drawn attention and sort of helped shape and give birth to this field of energy humanities. But it's portable, and I think people across the world, especially in Europe, where I think that the reception of energy humanities has been very strong, and I think where you've seen the first kinds of postdoctoral fellowships in energy humanities appearing and so forth, it's great to see that field continue to take shape. My own modest contribution to this as an ethnographer has been, my work on wind power in Latin America, particularly in Mexico and the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. The joint project that I did with Cymene Howe from 2009 through 2013, principally, the field work for that project was on the constitution of the densest landscape of onshore wind development anywhere in the world. 2.3, now I think closer to 2.7 gigawatts of wind power within a quite dense area of land that's mostly indigenous, and of places that don't recognize private property regimes, or at least private property regimes are in competition with communal property regimes in ways that create really powerful political contests over sovereignty, indigenous sovereignty, resource sovereignty. And it was a fascinating, troubling study because on the one hand, of course, we are renewable energy advocates. We think that this is a transition that has to happen, but we also came to understand through the course of the research that simply sort of greening the supply of electricity will do nothing to save the world if one doesn't also take on all of the other infrastructures, habits, institutions that are based upon a colonial extractive resources model that left the indigenous people in this part of Mexico feeling that wind parks were no different than mines. They were no different than fossil fuel infrastructure because all of them came, took land, fenced it off, enclosed it, took away their livelihood and rights, and didn't necessarily offer anything by way of engagement, a discussion over what futures were desired in local communities. They were only sort of focused on objectives to be achieved, whether it was financial returns or sort of greening the environment that were established in places like Madrid and New York. So lots to say about that project, and happy to dive into it. But this was sort of, if you will, the major takeaway thought of it. At the same time, or shortly thereafter, that research was wrapping up. I was fortunate enough to be able to found a research center at Rice, the acronym of which is CENHS. We always call it CENS. And you see the logo there on the left-hand side. It's morphed now into Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, so it continues on under a different name. But the projects that I was most proud of being involved in at that time were both some art projects that I want to talk to you a little bit about, as well as a couple of projects that engaged local governments and community groups in the Houston area. So we tried to do work that was more sort of global in its imagination at some level, or at least sort of transcultural, but also that had a meaningful connection to place, because so much of the struggle against the Anthropocene trajectory is precisely against sort of resisting the charisma of the global or the planetary and trying to situate ourselves in the places and the relationships that matter, and to be, as many indigenous philosophers say in this part of the world, to be in good relation, to build relations of trust and care again that have been, for the most part, ignored in the course of petromodernity. So I'll just really briefly talk about some of these projects, and I'm happy to circle back to any of them you might find intriguing. The one in the center is a project we did together with a New York-based artist named Marina Zurko called Making the Best of It. And Marina is just a brilliant, brilliant artist. If you're not aware of her work, I think you should check her out. She's done a number of projects, any one of which you'll find inspiring and interesting. But this one was about the future of seafood and about the relationship of the Gulf of Mexico as a particular kind of aquatic environment to petroleum extraction and processing and so forth. And one of the things that's happened in the Gulf of Mexico is between all of the industrial activity that's happened in the area, as well as, of course, industrial agriculture with its many kinds of contaminants that come down through the Mississippi River Basin. One finds that these are extremely distressed marine ecosystems. Just so much distressed that mid-level food stocks, or what we would think of as food stocks, are beginning to die off. And there has been an incredible resurgence of ancient aquatic species like jellyfish and algae that seem to be sort of taking advantage of the human mismanagement and over extraction of life forms from these aquatic environments. And so this was a project that explored the idea that the future of seafood is jellyfish. and algae. And it was done in a way that was artful, based around an artist's meal. We also worked with local chefs to sort of create jellyfish snacks and sort of, in other words, by meeting people in a space of commensality, of food, which is so fundamental to the experience of all life forms, we were able to sort of start some interesting conversations about, what does the Anthropocene taste like? What is this world going to be like in the future? And if you don't like the idea that, you're going to be eating jellyfish principally in the future, then what does that say about the kinds of habits and practices that are tolerated today? So this project, again, many interesting twists and turns. I'm happy to go in more. It turns out jellyfish, I think, are incredibly tasty. But, it's provocative, and the provocation through food and the Anthropocene context was a great aspect of this. In the right-hand corner, you see a guerrilla art project called Fossilized Houston. We worked together with a group of local artists to create, and as well as scientists at Rice, to talk about species who faced extinction specifically because of energy-related threats to their habitats. And we put together portraits done by local artists of these creatures and put them in the form of stickers and lawn signs, and then went out and sort of put them on SUV cars and put them around the city to create provocations to think about the impacts. Again, Houston as the center of the oil industry, as the home of the largest assemblage of petrochemical infrastructure in the Western Hemisphere. It is the place that is, as much as one place could say to be guilty and responsible for these extinctions, Houston would be that place. And of course, it's a place that also leaves an extraordinarily unsustainable megacity settler industrial lifestyle. So the idea was to use art as a way to confront, in this case, and to provoke, and it did in some cases. We got some angry messages. Happy to talk more about this later if you want. Less provocative, but I think no less impactful, in the lower right-hand corner. This is a project with the Chicago-based photographer Judy Natal, who came to the Gulf Coast to do research on the relationship of communities to extreme storm events. And the title of the project is Another Storm is Coming. And she went especially to what's known as the Hurricane Alley, the corridor that's in southeastern Texas and southwestern Louisiana that receives more hurricane strikes with greater frequency and intensity than any place else in the United States, to talk with these communities. And it was a fascinating project because she got into the sort of folklore involved with storms, the histories, the songs and incantations that people use to ward off storms, as well as you see here the documentation of the after effects of storms in a way that, again, visually extremely powerful. We were able to create a very specific exhibition event in 3 solar-powered studios on the Rice University campus that created, as well as a library of artifacts that she found in the course of her research, that created a kind of a powerful, immersive experience, and one in which you could contemplate, in a rather beautiful natural setting, as Houston goes, the powerful impacts of storms, and the way that storms are very much a part of the culture of this region, even as they're evolving in ways fueled by, supercharged, some say, by climate change to become ever more devastating. That, I think, brings me to Hurricane Harvey, which was an inflection point in the life of any Houstonian. I don't know how much you remember it. It was almost 5 years ago now. But Hurricane Harvey was the largest rainfall event in the history of the continental United States. To give you a sense of the scale and scope of it, it's a little difficult. It created $100 billion of damage. It flooded 200,000 homes, displaced tens of thousands of people. The death count was not insubstantial, but I think it was around 100 people all told. And Harris County, which is where Houston is home to 4.7 million people. And there was a point at the heaviest rainfall during Harvey that 75% of the land of Harris County was under 45 centimeters of water, standing water that was moving towards the Gulf of Mexico. So it was like nothing I've ever experienced. I mean, it was a truly biblical, I suppose, would be the only analogy I can think of, a biblical kind of rainfall, but one, again, that's been estimated to have been made 30, perhaps 40% worse by anthropogenic climate change. So this event, which paralyzed the city, actually caused, in some, if we want to talk about the positive silver linings of it, it caused an awakening of local politicians and community leaders to the need for more concerted climate action in Houston. So Houston passed its first ever climate action plan 3 years after Harvey, and that's not that was entirely related to this as a catalytic event. But for me, in the work of the center, what we tried to do was to see if we could use some of our expertise across the human sciences in engaging local government. And you'll have to, I know I'm speaking to you in Denmark, which in so many ways is like on the forefront of this. So this is going to seem like we just invented the stone wheel and we're so proud of it, what's happening in Houston, but you have to understand how little has been done. So little has been done in a place like Houston in terms of climate analysis, climate planning, regionally and locally specific climate change scenarios, that this very remedial work that we're doing was still kind of a breakthrough in our local terms. So we worked together with Harris County on a climate vulnerability study, looking at scenarios of sea level rise, of heat rise, and rainfall, futures of rainfall scenarios too. And I'm just going to show you a couple of the visualizations we created through this project. And one of them here concerns sea level rise, which is this is a 3-meter sea level rise scenario. It's a modest one. You see that, in fact, if you look at this area, it doesn't look that dramatic. On the right image, the inset image, though, you see that the barrier islands, where Galveston is, for example, disappear at 3 meters, which means that essentially there's nothing preventing now a major hurricane strike from not only hitting the coast, but actually hitting the city of Houston itself, which is about 50 miles inland. And you'll see here why that matters. This is a different part of the analysis that looks at storm surge, so the wall of water that's pushed by a major cyclone as it approaches Houston. And this is, again, I think a category 3, I don't know if this is a category 3 or category 5, but in any case, a major hurricane, and the kind of hurricane that has struck the Houston area in many times in past decades, and that we can predict will occur more frequently in the future. These areas that are in red or sort of purple are more of the kind of, again, sort of 1 to 3 meter of saturation and inundation. And the gold areas, though, are more like 6 or 7 meters of water. Now, the reason this matters, this else probably seems rather abstract. I'm going to circle that I hope you can see this little inlet here. This little inlet is known as the Houston Ship Channel. And the Houston Ship Channel, which was completed at the beginning of the 20th century to allow Houston to have a deep water port, and also because of the dredging and so forth, now creates a better way for storm surge to access the center of the city. This is again, the heart of the densest petrochemical infrastructural conglomeration in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, the only place in the world that has more petrochemical infrastructure than Houston is a complex in Saudi Arabia. And there are thousands, literally thousands of unsecured petrochemical storage containers that are sitting like 1 or 2 meters above ground. And imagine what happens when a 7-meter wall of water hits those. If even 10% of those containers were to fail, and that's a very conservative estimate. I mean, some of my colleagues in engineering at Rice think it's probably more likely 30 or 40% of those containers would fail, and spill the contents of both fossil fuels and petrochemicals into the city, and the wall of water brings them into the city. You have to imagine something like the Exxon Valdez spill, which, if you're not familiar with it, you can look it up on Wikipedia. The Exxon Valdez spill in Alaska, about that quantity of fuel being dumped in the middle of the 4th largest city in the United States. And what would that be? So in so many ways that I think, again, have been made invisible to the outside world, Houston is, as much as any city that I've ever seen, is a time bomb. It's simply waiting for the right storm to hit it in the right way, and you will have a city that's soaked not in water, but in oil and in its many derivative products. So this is part of if you will, the local sense of urgency that animates my work in this area too, is getting people to understand just what they're living with, and how much of the sort of the strategy of petroculture is, of course, to place these things at a distance, to make them invisible, to make us think that we're not living in this incredibly volatile space. But here, again, Houston, incredibly responsible for the Anthropocene condition, and also in some ways one of the most precarious places to its lateral effects. And another image that I like to show around town to sort of provoke people is the fact that, even in the most generous IPC scenarios for how we might rein in emissions, the amount of emissions that are currently in the atmosphere are enough to put us on a Neopliocene pathway. So even if we didn't sort of add anything else to them, we know that carbon takes quite a long time to get out of the atmosphere back into the ground or into trees again. So if we were to sort of just hold steady rather than to, of course, increase our emissions as the way we're currently doing as a planet, we would be securely in a Neopliocene scenario going forth for the next few thousand years. The Pliocene period was a period when sea level rise average global sea level was about 20 meters higher than it is today. So if you're thinking in deep time, Houston is already underwater. It will take only a period of some centuries for the ice to melt such that the aquatic and coastal conditions adapt to the atmospheric conditions that have been changed. And so this is what Houston will look like in a 20 meters Neopliocene scenario. It's underwater, or at best a kind of a coastal city. So this is, again, something that is beyond, for the most part, the political conversations of today, but sort of cultivating a deep time awareness of coastal conditions, especially in this part of the world, is something that I'm quite committed to, because, this is, not just the tip of the iceberg, pardon the pun. Obviously, a place like Florida is gone, most of Louisiana gone. The Gulf Coast, this whole low-lying area will be transformed dramatically by the sea level rise scenarios that are coming. And so the work I've been working on with my colleagues, have been trying to draw more attention to that. But closer, probably more familiar than to back away from the Houston-specific work, is the work we've been doing in Iceland, Cymene and I, and in particular following the story of the first major Icelandic glacier to fall victim to climate change, Okjökull. That discovery was made by an Icelandic glaciologist named Ólafur Sigurdsson in 2014. It was not given a whole lot of attention in Iceland, let alone the rest of the world. When we discovered that this had happened, that the first glacier had perished, the first major glacier in Iceland had perished, we thought, it might be something that was worth documenting and bringing to the world. And so that was the reason we put together this documentary film project, Not Okay or Not Ok. There's a sort of a pun in there too. A little movie about a small glacier at the end of the world. And in the course of this project, which was sort of an ethnographic documentary, you could say, we didn't have a particular perspective going in other than wanting to understand people's relationship to ice in Iceland and their thoughts about the loss of this glacier and to what extent they were concerned about it. Out of this came some really interesting conversations with Icelanders about memory and about memorials and about whether a glacier is alive and how one commemorates its passing. And that led to a project that I'll show on the next slide, the memorial for the glacier. But meanwhile, at about the same time we were working on this project, we're also doing our podcast, which is recently back, if you're interested. We did 200 episodes between 2016 was it, and 2019. And then took 2 years off to work on other projects and came back with a new run of 10 episodes that we're in the middle of launching right now. So it's a great time if you're interested in environmental humanities conversations. It's a great thing to check out. You can find it on iTunes or probably most of your podcast apps. And I'm happy to talk more about this as a collaborative project, but I'll say that it was definitely shaped by the work of the center, by a desire to not only find ways to bring these conversations to wider audiences, but also to find a way to process for ourselves our own senses of concern and grief and anxiety, to try to create an approach to these problems that was not simply depressive, that was also a place in which we can apprehend the fact that whatever is coming in the world, that world will also have joy in it. It'll be a full world, not a world that's a sort of caricature of living reality, but a reality that's very complex. And I think that's important because one of the things that we noticed in both the film project and the podcasting project is that the emotional bandwidth of climate communications is often quite narrow. There's a lot of grief and a lot of shame, a lot of self-loathing, a lot of anger, often directed at people who, one has every right to be angry against. But the fact that the emotional bandwidth is so narrow, in some ways, I believe, actually minimizes our ability to engage this changing world in a direct way, because it almost becomes like a horror film. And part of what makes horror work is the understanding of a gap between yourself as a viewer and the horrible events that are unfolding somewhere else. Humor, care, other kinds of emotions that create more of a kind of complexity to the emotional engagement of something like climate change, actually, strangely, I think can help to bring people in and take it more seriously. As our collaborator on the Ok movie project, Jon Gunnar, who is the mayor of Reykjavik, sort of a famous sort of joke candidate who then won his election and became somebody who really transformed Icelandic politics in some fundamental ways. As he has often said to us, just because something is funny doesn't mean it's not serious. And understanding both the sort of ridiculousness of the situation that the European model of modernity has put the rest of the world in, but also appreciating the fact that that he will take, in addition to sort of grand actions, which I'm all in favor of course, it will also take humility, it will take joy, love, care to create the kind of future beyond the Anthropocene trajectory that is worth living. So we're all about sort of trying to explore different emotional approaches and narrative approaches to thinking about climate change and its various subsidiary effects. And again, case in point, the work of the Okjökull Memorial here. The words are by our another Icelandic collaborator, Andres Snær Magnusson, who has a beautiful new book called On Time and Water that is out now in, I think, every language under the sun. We're trying to find a simple message to engage this intergenerational problem of understanding that that we know what's going on, right? We know what needs to be done, and future generations will judge us for whether we were able to do anything to avert the worst scenarios of catastrophe. And we thought this would be a project that would have a certain resonance in Iceland, and that was really our effort, was to create something that spoke to the Icelandic conversation. It was interesting that when it got out on social media, it became much more of a global phenomenon, and in a way that we find very sort of amazing, that so many people were moved by the story of this little glacier, that it had lived a life largely in the shadow of its more famous neighboring glaciers for its whole existence, and never really was something that had claimed a great deal of public attention at any point in its history, now was receiving a posthumous celebration by so many people. We've heard from other groups of people, including the group that memorialized the glacier Pitsol in Switzerland, that actually, we weren't even the first to this idea. Other groups of people have been organizing to memorialize glaciers too, and other natural bodies. And there's a whole conversation there about how the Anthropocene condition also reorients our relationship to quote unquote natural bodies, rivers, forests, mountains, glaciers, and so forth, in ways that I think are again informed by older indigenous traditions of thinking about earth beings, for example. And so we found that glacier memorials have taken place in Mexico, in Colombia, in the Pyrenees, in other places. And in a couple of cases, they've just used Andre's text and just translated it into another language. So in a way, the words that are on the Okjökull glacier sort of become the sort of ritual commemorative words for the death of a glacier at the hands of anthropogenic climate change in a way that's, I think is, again, just humbling would be the word I would say. On the right-hand image there, you have where I am right now, Los Angeles, Mayor Garcetti, when he was taking on the chairship of the C40 Climate Cities Network, which is a group of mayors who are trying to push for more aggressive climate action than typically is being offered or allowed by national governments. He read the entirety of the text of the plaque as part of his speech and showed the images. And that kind of circulation, I think, is really helpful, I think, in terms of raising awareness of these issues and the impacts and what's being lost. And again, not just in the sense of we should be depressed, and I'm happy to talk more about this if you're interested, but also in the positive sense of community building, because the experience of hiking to the top of Oak Mountain and having the ritual to install this plaque was not as sad an affair as one might suspect. I think there was a lot of joy as part of this event too, just to see how many people had turned out to participate in it, and a sense, of being part of a community of care where people were moved by this, and to be around other people who were similarly moved made one feel less isolated, less sort of alone with one's existential conditions of anxiety and despair. And so, I think if nothing else, as an anthropologist, the importance of ritual as a way of managing loss, mourning as a way of creating a positive sense of community that goes forward is something that I think is a very important kind of practice to develop further as we go deeper and deeper into the Anthropocene. So just back to my own research here, the research that I'm doing in Houston and Los Angeles now, sort of with my sort of anthropologist researcher hat on, concerns electricity and decarbonization through electrification. Almost every scenario for the future of a decarbonized global economy involves shifting the energy mix heavily towards electricity, in some cases totally towards electricity. We have this phrase, electrify everything, which I'm not sure if it's exactly what you might say in Denmark, but it's I think you understand the sentiment of it and the logic. But it raises a lot of questions, and I'm sure these are, again, lost on you already. How might these new electric futures remake energy landscapes? The work of Carola Hein, among others, on the industrialized sea comes to mind. The resource politics of lithium mining, if we stay with the sort of conventional battery technologies that we have. What are the new kinds of energy politics, or energopolitics, as I would like to call them, and citizenship that are coming into being around electricity initiatives? What is the balance between sort of top-down or state-led initiatives and those that sort of emerge in more grassroots or decentralized fashions? How will the expertise, sort of the engineering expertise surrounding electricity change as these new electric futures come into being? And then, of course, how might our domestic spaces, our workspaces, and so forth be conceived? So it's a rather broad project, and the part of it that I'm working on right now is really about the sort of politics of Electrify Everything initiatives and how they are taking shape within the very contentious situations in Texas and California. Very different situations, but they have their own sort of points of contention, their own political landscapes. And if you will, it's a kind of a sounding of the electropolitics, emergent electropolitics that are surrounding these issues. Also, going back to that Neopliocene coastline map, Cymene and I are very interested in working with artists and thinking about what we're calling amphibious urbanism. In other words, a model of urbanism that no longer believes that the water can be kept at bay, but is coming to accept the fact that coastal cities will have to co-evolve with more and more presence of water. This is a point that Casper Brun-Jensen has made, the STS scholar has made very powerfully by saying, the amphibious is sort of the future of coastal life. And we're thinking about, well, what does this mean? What kinds of utopias can be imagined? And we've been working with local artists and designers and sort of imagining, these are sort of some of the more far out speculative designs, but you sort of get a sense of sort of the idea of some of the ways in which we're hoping to inspire thought and conversation about the future. Because in a place like Houston that's so kind of relentlessly wants to believe that the 20th century modern model of like, clean land, clean sort of waterways that can be contained, clear dry land can be separated and managed through these sort of command and control ideologies. In a place like Houston, to try to begin to push against that common sense, I think has a certain value. And so that's what we're working on. Finally, and I'm sorry I've talked for so long, finally, to get back to Metropolis, we are working on a television series proposal right now, which is trying to make what's invisible in Houston more visible and explore what holds us to a world that we know has no future, what holds us emotionally to a world that is actually destroying us. And again, Houston, I think, epitomizes this. The oil that built the city, the oil that made the city what it is literally what is creating the superstorms that will now destroy it over time, and the advancing water that will soak it over time. And so we think because Houston has strangely never been the site of a major scripted television series, not since actually the 1980s, which in some ways was the last time Houston had a major kind of existential crisis in the collapse of the oil markets in the 80s. So there hasn't been a chance to explore sort of the existential concerns of the contemporary through the sort of landscape and the intertwined lives of Houston for many years, and that's what we're seeking to do. So this is a project very much sort of in the works at the moment. I don't have a lot to show you other than a lot of concept art and excuse me, and scripts and treatments and things like that. But again, we find ourselves oscillating between academic work, which is trying to sort of bring a certain, as the Germans would say, Sachlichkeit to the matter, a certain kind of expertise and facticity, at the same time that we sort of understand the limits of those approaches and are really trying also to explore multimodal, creative kinds of engagements that we think ultimately may have more chance of changing people's orientation towards these issues. I mean, there's a lot, excuse me, a lot of discussion of sort of, getting people woke to climate here in the United States and what it takes to do that. And I'm happy to have that discussion because I've got a lot of thoughts about it. But as you can imagine, part of what the obstacle is that we are all too comfortable with our petrocultural luxuries and the intensities of energy usage that we've come to think we are owed them, that they are due somehow. And not to think about what it would mean to, say, take the American model of modernity and to globalize it, how that would lead to nothing worse than not only a Neopliocene pathway, but a Neo-Eocene pathway, which we're talking 4 to 7 degrees centigrade global warming. Absolutely questionable whether humanity in its present configuration could survive, let alone all the innumerable other species that would perish in that process. So again, we are committed to this ecocidal trajectory. How do we get off of it is the great riddle that animates me now and is really sort of the focus of my work these days. So thank you for your time, your patience. Very interested to chat more, and I do hope we now have plenty of time for discussions.
I unmute myself and I look for the applause sign. Thank you so much, Dominic. That was really wonderful, awesome. I think incredible tour de force over the last decade of your very rich, or more than last decade, of your very rich academic and also media research and or outreach. As a core interest, probably also, as you just put it. I have so many questions myself I would love to ask, but I also would like to ask to the group at first if someone has a burning question right away. Is there someone who raises their hand? Please either raise your hand or also write your questions in the chat. And maybe I change to gallery view again too. So, but actually what I'm, where should I start? So many questions. I don't know if that's the best question to begin with, because you, I noted down while listening to you, after all your engagement in this topic in the last decade, I'm wondering, are you confident that the European model of modernity will be overcome before we go extinct?
It's such an interesting question, Anya, and because I would also differentiate the if you will, I would say the 19th century model of European modernity, which continues to be the 21st century model of American modernity, because I think there's a through line between these two. Relentless expansion, industrialization, resource use, energy expenditures up and up and up. That you could call this the European modernity, and maybe historically speaking, that's accurate. But I think I'm more comfortable thinking of it now as sort of the American modernity, because I see that in Europe, there's a real effort to change. And I want to really acknowledge that I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you based virtually, at least in Denmark, where, probably has as much claim to be pioneering the models of a more sustainable model of modernity. And again, I understand this is, you probably have a lot of criticisms of what's being done and not enough is being done, not fast enough, but at least compared to where I'm positioned in a place like Houston or even Los Angeles for that matter, so much more is being done in Europe right now to actually meaningfully tackle these challenges and to take them serious in a way that engages not only the science and the engineering, but also the cultural, social, political dimensions of it. That one has to think that, perhaps there is a way in which the new model of European modernity might take shape in a way that is less ecocidal. I don't think that it's guaranteed to happen. I think enormous political pressure will have to continue to be placed, mostly from the grassroots, upon actors to do this. But I'll say that one of the projects, and I didn't mention this because it's a little more speculative, but one of the projects I'm really excited, I just did a treatment for another documentary film that I would love to do, and I hope it works, to do a profile of Hermann Scheer, who's been sort of a hero of mine, social democratic sort of backbencher in Germany, who was really the political pioneer of the Energiewende in Germany. A fact that I think, because he died young, hasn't really maybe soaked in as much as the world has caught up to his more revolutionary demands. And the idea that this sort of, at one level, just a kind of, political, veteran actor, bureaucrat sort of figure could actually dream up, let alone put into action, a trajectory for decarbonizing electricity that was so revolutionary that they realized that it actually would have destroyed Germany's utilities pretty quickly if they'd allowed it to continue. So they had to pull it back again, and that's why the solar energy boom and bust happened in Germany so quickly. But to sort of bring that kind of story as a profile in political courage, of course, but also for when we hear about, the blah, blah, blah of politics around COP meetings and so forth, and I totally understand that reaction.
Her Greta Thunberg's phrase, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Greta Thunberg's face, exactly. But at the same time, it's not. There are these other examples that if we were to sort of boost them and put the spotlight on them, I think to demand, hey, why isn't our political class sort of proceeding with the ambition and the conviction and also the kind of the Fingerspitzengefühl, which I don't even know how to translate that English, but the sense of touch in one's fingertips it requires to do delicate things. The Fingerspitzengefühl that takes to actually make aggressive political policies happen and not just become a matter of sort of grand statements that are made, because finally we're getting the political class to make a few grand statements, but a lot of it's still not being translated into action in institutions. And so I'll just say that, again, this is sort of where you can hear sort of my own sort of enthusiasm for these creative projects as a way of, perhaps changing narratives or putting new narratives out there.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Any other questions or comments, Jenny?
Thank you, Dominic. It's really inspiring to me how many sort of variations of your work you have, like different strands that are both, policy oriented and also narrative based. And I guess I was just thinking about I feel like with all of the things that I've read and watched of your stuff, the one of the most powerful is, and I don't know if this was your doing, but the language on that that tombstone or the monument. And when I read it, it's so interesting because it's like there's a we in it and there's a you in it, and you have to kind of imagine the you and project yourself into that. There's just something about like the creating like these subjects and objects of the story that I think is really powerful. And then I was just really thinking about like, well, who also is your, like, do you ever think about like who is your target audience, or who is your prime target audience? Because I just really wonder whether like a children's campaign could be really good, because also they seem to be very effective. Like, a whole bunch, I mean, Greta Thunberg is like more effective than a lot of the activists, or she's visible in a different kind of way. So I guess, yeah, I just was wondering, like, do you think much about like who is the best target audience, or is it just, blasting it everywhere? So I guess there's sort of a comment and a question in that.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. It's such an important question. And I think as we sort of verged more and more into sort of media work, that question of audience is constant. You can't ever escape. Who are you trying to reach with this? What are the strategies for reaching people? And it's generally been my experience, although I think it does vary from place to place, that, generally speaking, younger folks are much more attuned to these issues and much more sort of already emotionally engaged with them than, say, people of my generation and identity are. So I guess in a sense, like, I think part of it is, yes, you want to reach out, you want to engage the youth, you want to let them know that there are sort of that there are responsible grown-ups that are not just dumping, the problems and mistakes of previous generations upon them, which is, I think, somehow abandoning them essentially to a future that has been stolen from them by this sort of ecological Ponzi scheme the world has been engaged in for now some centuries. So I think that, yeah, absolutely, to sort of reach out, to engage, and a couple of smaller projects have aimed at teenagers, who I find teenagers are a really interesting class, biologically adult, yet sort of socially still forcibly made immature, and in ways that I think actually sort of is a really incredible resource, because oftentimes I found it's the teenagers who sort of are the ones who are really leading the charge, who are the angriest, or the most engaged. They understand the issues, and sort of harnessing their energy and shaping it, I think, is something that could be really powerful, as it was with Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion and all the other movements that sort of relied on some of that teenage rage to fuel them. At the same time, I think the other question that is pretty pertinent is, if you're looking at the people who continue to be living sort of blithely in different high carbon lifestyles, there are probably more people who are the older side of the spectrum. And then how do you get these people to sort of really engage in projects of personal, not just personal change, but civilizational change in ways that make them think, okay, well, maybe I'm only going to be on this planet another 20 years, so what does it matter to me? But to understand that that the legacies you're leaving will directly impact your children and your children's children. And what's so brilliant, I would just say, so we didn't do the words for the plaque. As I said, Andres Snyder Magnusson did them. But Andre in his book has this amazing thought exercise that is like worth the price of admission alone, where he talks about, and he talks about this in the movie too, actually, in the film, because we met him through interviewing him for the Not Okay documentary. So he says, he asked this question of like, how many years in the future is somebody who you love still alive? And how could you pass, like, how far in the future could you pass a personal message, right? To, let's say you're my age, Andre's age, right? You have a 10-year-old grandchild, somebody you love. And how how far in the future is somebody that she loves still going to be alive? Somebody you could directly pass like a message to the future to. And he did the calculation. He was like 2170, right? So 2170, by the way, has a specific significance in terms of the discussion of Icelandic glaciers, because that's currently the projected date, more or less, by which all the Icelandic glaciers will be gone if we stay on the current trajectory. So a country that literally has ice in its name no longer has any ice to offer. That will be, so he could, by speaking to his own granddaughter, sort of contact a person in the future who, so sort of through a chain of care and love and connection, who's going to be living in that future world. So the point he takes away from it that I think is so important and powerful is like we talk about, our time as though we're sort of, only, our personal existence, but to think about this through lineage and to think about this through kinship and love extends that out, so much farther into the future. In ways that I think, I think his point is like, if our politics were to follow that logic, how much different would our politics look? And so, so that's kind of how I've been inspired to think about it too.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Jenny, you wanted to add something, or?
Oh, it was just more about like the ability of really young children to because I was given this book, The Giving Tree by Shel Silverstone,
Great book.
I think that one that really has affected me, because maybe you all don't know this book, but yeah, you really see from the perspective of a tree that was used by this one man, and you learn all the ways he's abused and used the tree, and at the end it's an old man sitting on the stump of the tree. And it's like, I don't know, there's just something is about this like understanding and this deep level and the deep love that children can have for like a tree, because they're still living in that world where they're not differentiating. That's why sort of also why I was asking you about the narratives to children, because they're still forming,
Right.
Whereas like the older person who's already lived in the petro, I'm sorry, but I mean, I think it's a lot bigger of a stretch to have a paradigm shift unless they're
I mean, I totally agree. And there's this kind of I'm actually writing another book on sort of fossilization right now that is about this and about gerontocracy and the fact that we have this sort of petro-gerontocracy as like older and older political leaders. Like, we're going to wait till they're like 120, we're going to still be electing these people, right? But like, in the United States, septuagenarian Joe Biden, 78 versus, it's like they don't, like, it's a totally different relationship. I think you're right, to possibility that is sort of understandable at a human level, but also completely unacceptable at a political level. So I agree. And that's The Giving Tree is a beautiful lyrical work that is, again, the greatest example kind of how art can shape minds and shape thinking about things.
Wonderful, thank you. Actually, Aldo, you had raised your hand first, and then
yes. Hi, Dominic. It was an amazing presentation. I have a specific question. I read the introduction of your book, Energopolitics, from 2019. And I wanted to ask you if you find a solution, we can talk about solutions, in Istmo de Tehuantepec, because sometimes we can think that it's a matter of just a matter of geopolitics, but in a place like in the Istmo, where you have a lot of different actors interacting, opposing, avoiding, supporting different discourses, cosmogonies, it is not just that to introduce renewable energy, you have to convince the political formal organizations from municipality or state or federal government, but you have to interact with a lot of more actors. I mean, I didn't read all your book. Maybe you find a solution, or we cannot talk about solutions. We can just imagine a different future. I don't know. So that's the reason I want to ask you what kind of solution we can give where you have a lot of things going on in a place like this, Tehuantepec. Thank you.
Thank you, Aldo.
Just briefly say what it is for the others who didn't read it.
So it's the Energopolitics book, and he read the introduction to it, and he was asking a little bit about the solutions. And I'm totally happy to talk about solutions. I understand that one way sometimes we engage these things is to say, well, it's very complex, and we don't know. We have to sort of imagine a better world before we can make it. I tend to think that that's like a little bit, like that would be nice if we had time to do that. That we have to act, and we are acting, and the actions that are currently being acted are the ones that are continuing to destabilize us. So let's also talk about actions. Maybe it's not solutions, but actions that move towards a better world. And so in the case of wind parks in Mexico, we did find a model that is much better than the one that is currently being pursued. In other words, there was a community, an ancestral Zapotec farming community that had allied itself with an NGO that wanted to build the first community-owned wind park in Latin America. And it was actually on the Danish model. It was the old Danish model of the community wind park that's sort of well known, I think, on your end of things. And the problem was that the way in which the development policy had been designed, the only way you could take on such a project would be if you had the banking of sort of very wealthy banks and financial investors that could show the sort of having a certain amount of money in the bank to take on a project. Otherwise, they wouldn't even let you bid for grid access. So for a poor farming community, this was like an insurmountable barrier. And there was no sort of special development exception that would be made to sort of permit community wind parks, in part because the privately, or what they call PPP, private-public partnership model, which is the dominant one, is extremely lucrative for the government, for transnational wind developers, for local elites who get a little bit of money on the side from these projects too. So none of the sort of power brokers have any interest in sort of creating basically a not-for-profit wind power development model. But that model had a much higher degree of community acceptance because it took the revenues that were being generated by the wind park, and instead of sending it to shareholders, it reinvested them into social programs for the community and into sort of creating obras, sort of general works that would benefit the community as a whole. And so you had, in other words, you had sort of the embryo of a better model that was there for the taking, and people who were passionate to do it. And it was only the intransigence of the political class and the sort of the very neoliberal, frankly, development model that had been naturalized as the only way to develop this resource that were blocking it from coming into being. And so the first chapter of the book is about, the first ethnographic chapter is about the Ixtepec story. So if you're willing to read another chapter, read that one, because you'll see the model, you'll see why it's better than the existing world, and you also understand what's blocking it from coming into being. And I think then if we want to talk about actions, that's where we overturn things. That's where we have to sort of reciprocally overcome the obstacles towards the constitution of these better worlds.
Thank you
very much. I really very much can recommend the book. It's like, the confrontation of your energo power concept with reality, so to speak, and the complexities of reality. So I really found that a very great read. And now, Stefan, you raised your hand.
Yeah, thanks so much for giving us more insight into the diversity of your work. It's really fascinating. I have two questions. One concerning US politics more specifically, and this, or the question for generational change. How likely do you see in the nearer future a generational change happening in the two parties? And I mean, we don't really have to talk about the Republican Party, I think, or the agenda when it comes to environmental politics of the younger generation, because I don't see, a change on the horizon there. But, I'd be very happy if somebody proved me wrong. And what about the Democrats? What's your assessment? So how likely is a younger generation of Democrats to be in power and to actually, what is their agenda? Is there actually a change happening, or is it more, isolated figures like AOC, for example?
Right. Thank you, Stefan. Great questions and very important ones too. I don't want to totally give up the Republicans in the sense that there are some small voices, very marginalized voices, who are talking about the reality of climate change and the need to adapt to it. And they don't get a lot of attention, but there are a few. And some of them are in key areas like Florida that understand these existential challenges better. So maybe if the Republican Party can get past its sort of Trumpian nostalgia for the great American past that never really existed, if it can actually overcome that and its own sort of politics of basically its own kind of racism and gerontocratic politics, maybe those voices would have more strength. Because there was a time not so long ago when, Richard Nixon or even George Bush, for all the terrible things that they did in some sectors, they had better environmental policies than a lot of Democrats, mainstream Democrats, do today. So there is some chance there. In terms of the transformation of the Democratic Party, I think it's already happening. I mean, you see sort of if you will, the way I analyze the sort of the current situation of impasse around the Biden agenda is that Biden, who's a sort of consummate transactional politician, he's an empty vessel for wherever the political energy is. And so back in the 90s, he was a sort of tried and true, sort of new left neoliberal Democrat. And now that, he's in his 70s, he's seeing the political energy is all coming from the youth movement, all from the AOC wing of the party. Whenever these people have a chance to sort of run a primary against a sort of established mainstream conventional Democrat, they win increasingly, because they have the passion, they have the conviction, they want to change the world for the better. And there's so many inspiring people in their ranks that it's really like it makes me feel like hopeful to some extent about the future of the American left, at least. The American left is in a better place now than at any point in my life, I would say, hands down. And I'm about 50 years old, so that gives you a sense of the scope. Have there been better things in the past? Yes, it'd be great if we had conviction for like a Roosevelt-style New Deal. A lot of things could be better, but we're going in a good direction on the left overall. It's really being defined by the energy of the younger generation, but yet it's gerontocratic. The U.S. Senate has never been as old, apparently, as it is today, and you have people like Dianne Feinstein from California who are basically unable to function, who are still senators. Could this not be just exactly the moment to clear space for one of these articulate, brilliant younger change makers to come in? It will happen. It can't happen soon enough, is what I would say. So, but the other thing, let me just say, is don't wait for America. The rest of the world needs to move on. America is not going to get its act together fast enough. There could be no more, let's wait for change to happen in Washington. I think Washington, the very fact of the election of somebody like Trump means that no one should trust American politics, not without a sort of major generational changeover that may take a couple of decades, because I can't tell you that Trump won't be elected again, or some Trump-light figure like the governor of Florida, something like that. It's entirely possible and perhaps even probable that will happen in 3 years. So the rest of the world needs to move on and sort of fight, obviously their own demons that you have in Europe with the resurgence of ethno-nationalist exclusionary politics. And there's a lot to fight everywhere, but I think that some places that are willing to sort of commit long-term to science-led social and environmental and political initiatives can't wait for anybody on this side of the Atlantic to get their act together. It's just important to move on and sort of redistribute the center of what's the leading edge of modernity back towards Europe again. I'm pretty convinced that has to happen.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks also from me. Yeah, and it's I think it's really so interesting because it resonates very well with our first lecture, where we had a paleoclimatist physicist, Anders Svensson from Copenhagen University, reporting about Greenland and also how the melting of the ice is affecting Copenhagen and how Copenhagen is already quite advanced in its politics, and contrasting that to what you're telling about Houston and also Texas as the beast of the belly, as you called it. And I was wondering, because you mentioned in your talk that you had some very harsh or aggressive experiences too, or like, yeah, what do you have for experience after the last decade or 12, 15 years of grassroots, or not academic work, but also activism with the provocative flyers you said or something? Like, how do the people react? And do you have the impression that there is something changing in Houston regarding awareness for climate change?
Yes, I really think there has. In the past 5 years, a lot has changed. And again, looking from the outside world, it doesn't seem like that much, but by local standards, a lot is changing. And I was actually the call I was on just before this call was with a group of activists who work in one of the historically marginalized African American neighborhoods of Houston that have been working really hard on issues of climate and sustainability. And I was sort of sharing my impression with them. I was like, do you think Houston's changing for the better? And they was like, oh yeah, they've been at this for 40 years as compared with mine, maybe 10 years. And they said, oh yeah, no, things have really changed a lot. It's just that we're so far behind, we have so far to go. And it's sort of a race against time because, as I said, there is a storm that could destroy Houston that could happen next summer, could happen the summer after that. It's just sort of waiting for that to happen. And again, it may take 20 years or 30 years, but that storm is coming. And the question is, can Houston adapt? Can Houston understand its situation and its precarity in a way that it can make a responsible decision, or else it will become like so many ruins of other civilizations that were wrecked on their own hubris, and unwillingness to sort of accept that they could not control the world around them fully. So we'll see. Houston for me is kind of like Mordor. It's like being in Mordor a lot when you think about climate politics. It's kind of, but yet, if we learn nothing else from the Lord of the Rings, it's that that actually, if things don't change in Mordor, the rest of the world's not going to change either. So you have to have some hobbits who are going to kind of get that ring up into Mount Doom, and that's kind of the work that we try to do here, is just to kind of keep inching forward, with the projects that could help, create an end to petroculture at the very center of the machine. Wish us luck is all I would say.
For sure. Actually, I would like to, we have 10 minutes left, if that's fine with you. And I would like to, I have two, a little bit more general questions. The one thing which I found also very interesting, we mentioned Energy Humanities, and you also wrote in this manifesto, even that when you talk to people who play a key role in this petroculture, like scientists, natural scientists, politicians, government, and engineers, they have been waiting for the humanities. Have they really? And in what way? What do they expect from the humanities, or what do you see the role of the humanities?
It's a really great question, Ani. I think it's a great one to end on too, because we sort of circle back to where we started with, the importance of the humanities going forward. And I swear to you, I'm not making this up. It was a competitive process to get our center funded at Rice, and there were a lot of other interest groups who were trying to get their centers funded. And the thing that made it work for us was that a lot of our colleagues in the sciences and engineering said, yes, we need this. We need people who understand the social, the cultural, the political dimensions of energy and environmental relationships, because we know that we can create technologies. That's what we do, is we create technologies, and Rice is sort of an engineering school that does that. That's kind of what they do. But they also understand that no technology will save the world, because a technology by itself is just it's just a machine that has no specific kind of operation. And also, people don't always accept the things that are good for them, as you see with renewable energy technology. We have the technology to decarbonize the global economy right now. We don't need to wait for anything. We don't need to wait for magical technologies to show up. We have everything we need to do it right now. And that was Hermann Scheer's point, which I thank him for. What are we waiting for? The obstacles are politics and institutions and habits and understandings and worldviews and ethics and all the other things that the human sciences study. They need our expertise. We're the ones who actually have the expertise to overcome the gap. to break the impasse. And that's what Imre and I argued in that piece, obviously, but I truly believe that. And again, there probably are some sort of chauvinistic engineers and scientists who think they can fix it all with technology, but I think most of them have had enough experiences that they understand this needs a holistic approach. It needs climate change is not going to be solved by any one discipline. It's going to be solved, hopefully, by all of the disciplines of the university working together with all the other institutions of civil society and with all the relevant governmental bodies to place the. That's why when I say civilization change is what we need, because we all have to sort of work together on these issues. And the good news is, I think, like you can see in different parts of the world, that this is actually happening. Some places more quickly and effectively than others, and Houston is not at the top of anything. I'm not claiming it is, but the fact that even change is happening in Houston, even in Houston, home to the beating black heart of petroculture, that change is happening there is something that I think we can all say, yes, we're finally beginning to move civilizationally in a new direction. And at that point, it becomes a marvelous opportunity too, because it's not often that any generation of humans is given the opportunity and the necessity of creating a new civilization. That's great. That's something that you can get your students excited about. That's something you can get your fellow activists excited about, right? It's not just about fighting against the worst scenarios of what the Anthropocene could bring. It's about imagining and enacting the better future that we really want to live in.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's a wonderful, really, I think it's a wonderful end. And just, I want to know one thing. Are you writing Petropolis for Netflix, or where is it going to run? Where do you want it to run?
Netflix would be great. This is like a whole separate conversation. And if we get a deal to make it, I will come back and we can talk all the details. In fact, the reason I have to run is to go to a meeting with somebody who could be an ally in making these connections happen. So I'm going to a Petropolis meeting next. And I just want to say that, stay tuned. This is a project we're very committed to doing.
That's
and
why
if not,
you're at Los Angeles.
It's one of the reasons. It's because the home of the creative industry, such as it is here. So I just want to thank everyone. And for those who didn't get a chance to ask questions, please feel free to email me. I'll just drop my email in the chat. I am very open to continuing conversations and love to do it. As you can tell, this is kind of my passion, and it's just great to have, again, a group of people to chat with about our matters of common concern.
It's so inspirational. Thank you so much. And we'll share it on YouTube, and hopefully many more people will enjoy.